The martyrdom of Stephen, as recorded in Maria Valtorta's visions, gives us a great deal more detail than we find in the Acts of the Apostles, which is already quite detailed anyway. It also gives us an insight into the character of Saul before he converted on the road to Damascus and became Paul. And we also get some perspective on Gamaliel, who, if we've read the works of Maria Valtorta, will know that he was very obstinate and not willing to accept Jesus during Jesus' earthly life, but has a revelation after the death of Jesus and goes to Calvary, where Jesus is lying dead on the cross. And we see Gamaliel in the Acts of the Apostles only one time, when it comes to the attempt to persuade the Sanhedrin that they shouldn't persecute the apostles, because if it's of God, they can't stop it. And if it's not of God, it will peter out by itself. So I shall read the martyrdom of Stephen, chapter 641 of the 5th volume of The Poem of the Man God, 1986 English edition. The hall of the Sanhedrin is identical, both with regard to disposition and to people, to what it was in the night between Thursday and Friday during Jesus' trial. The high priest and the others are sitting on their seats. In the middle, in front of the high priest, in the empty space where, during the trial, Jesus was, there is now Stephen. He must have already spoken, professing his faith and bearing witness to the true nature of the Christ and to his church, because the tumult is at its climax, and in its violence it is similar to the one that raged against the Christ in the fatal night of the betrayal and deicide. Blows, curses, horrible oaths are hurled against the deacon Stephen, who, under the brutal blows, staggers and totters while they savagely tug him here and there. But he keeps his calm and dignity, and even more. He is not only calm and dignified, but he is even blissful and almost ecstatic, disregarding the spittles streaming down his face and the blood running from his nose that has been violently struck. At a certain moment, he raises his inspired face and his bright smiling eyes to stare at a vision known to him alone. He stretches his arms out crosswise. He raises them up as if he wished to embrace what he sees. Then he falls on his knees, exclaiming, "Here, I can see the heavens thrown open, and the Son of Man Jesus, the Christ of God, whom you have killed, standing at the right hand of God." Then the tumult loses even that least part that it still retained of humanity and legality. And with the fury of a pack of wolves, of jackals, of rabid wild beasts, they all hurl themselves on the deacon. They bite him, they trample on him, they grasp him, they raise him, lifting him by his hair, they drag him, letting him drop again, while fury opposes fury, because in the rush, those who try to drag the martyr outside are hindered by those who pull him in another direction to strike him and tread on him again. Among the most furious ones, there is a young, short, ugly-looking man named Saul. The fierceness of his face is indescribable. In a corner of the hall there is Gamaliel. He has never taken part in the brawl, neither has he ever addressed Stephen or any mighty person. His disgust for the unfair wild scene is manifest. In another corner there is Nicodemus, who is also disgusted and does not take part in the trial or in the brawl, and is looking at Gamaliel, whose countenance is clearer than any word. But suddenly and precisely, when he sees Stephen being lifted by the hair for the 3rd time, Gamaliel envelops himself in his very wide mantle, and he goes towards an exit in the opposite direction to that towards which the deacon is being dragged. His action does not pass unnoticed to Saul, who shouts, "Rabbi, are you going away?" Gamaliel does not reply. Saul, fearing that Gamaliel has not understood that the question was made to him, repeats and specifies it. "Rabbi Gamaliel, are you evading this judgment?" Gamaliel turns round all of one piece, and looking furious, disgusted as he is, dignified and frigid, he replies only, "Yes." But his yes is worth more than a long speech. Saul understands everything that yes implies, and leaving the wild pack, he rushes towards Gamaliel. He reaches him, stops him, says to him, "You are not going to tell me, O Rabbi, that you disapprove of our condemnation." Gamaliel does not look at him. Neither does he reply to him. Saul insists. That man is doubly guilty, as he denied the law, following a Samaritan possessed by Beelzebub, and for doing so after being your disciple. Gamaliel continues to look away from him and to be silent. Saul then asks him, "But are you perhaps, you as well, a follower of that criminal named Jesus?" Gamaliel now speaks and says, "I am not yet, but if he was what he said, and truly many things prove that he was, I pray God that I may become one." "Horrible!" shouts Saul. There is nothing horrible. Every man has an intelligence to make use of it, and a freedom to apply it. So let everybody make use of it according to that freedom that God has given to every man, and to that light that he's put in everybody's heart. The just, sooner or later, will use these two gifts of God for good purposes, and the wicked for evil purposes. And he goes away, directing his steps towards the court where the treasury is. And he goes and leans against the same column against which Jesus spoke of the poor widow, who gave the treasury of the temple everything she had, 2 farthings. He's not been there long when Saul joins him again and places himself in front of him. The contrast between the two is very strong. Gamaliel is tall, of a noble bearing, handsome in his strong Semitic features, with a high forehead, with eyes which are very dark, intelligent, piercing, long and deeply sunken under his thick, straight eyebrows on the sides of his nose, which is also straight, long and thin, and reminds one a little of Jesus' nose. Also his complexion, his thin-lipped mouth remind one of Jesus's. But Gamaliel's beard and moustache, once very dark, are now grizzled and longer. Saul instead is short, thick-set, almost rickety. His legs are short and thick, a little apart at the knees, which are clearly visible because he has taken his mantle off, and he has on only a short greyish tunic. His arms are short and brawny like his legs. His neck is short and thick-set, supporting a big brown head with short rough hair, with rather protruding ears, snub nose, thick lips, with high big cheekbones, bulging forehead, dark, rather bulging eyes, neither mild nor kind, but very intelligent under his very arched, thick, ruffled eyelashes. His cheeks are covered with a very thick beard, as bristly as his hair, but cut short. Perhaps, because of his very short neck, he seems to be slightly hunchbacked, or to have very round shoulders. Just pause there for a moment. That description, it's a while since I've read from an apocryphal document, a description of St. Paul, but it may be the Acts of Paul and Thecla, where a description of St. Paul is given, especially I think about his bulging eyes. He's not at all portrayed as a handsome man, and that may be a document from the 2nd or 3rd century, but it seems to have transmitted accurately the look of St. Paul. Valtorta continues. Speaking of Saul, he is silent for a moment, staring at Gamaliel. Then he says something to him in a low voice. Gamaliel replies to him in a clear, loud voice. "I do not approve of violence, for any reason whatsoever. You will never obtain my approval for any violent plan. I have told also all the Sanhedrin in public when Peter and the other apostles were arrested for the 2nd time, and brought before the Sanhedrin to be judged. And I repeat the same things. If it is the plan and work of men, it will perish by itself. If it comes from God, it cannot be destroyed by men. On the contrary, they may be struck by God. Bear that in mind. Just a pause there. As I was saying earlier on, we have this in the Acts of the Apostles, when Peter and John are brought before the Sanhedrin. Then Gamaliel speaks. And that's the only time we hear of him in the New Testament. So it's fortunate, a blessing from God, that we are given all this extra information about him now and throughout the rest of the poem of the man God, where he appears periodically. Saul continues, "Are you the protector of these blasphemous followers of the Nazarene? You, the greatest rabbi in Israel?" "I am the protector of justice. And justice teaches us to be prudent and just in judging. I repeat it to you. If the thing comes from God, it will last. If not, it will fall by itself. But I do not want to stain my hands with blood that I do not know whether it deserves death." Is that how you, a Pharisee and doctor, speak? Are you not afraid of the Most High? Says Saul. "More than you are. But I ponder, and I remember. You were only a little child, not yet a son of the law, and I was already teaching in this temple with the wisest rabbi of our days, and with others, wise but not just. Within these walls, our wisdom received a lesson that made us ponder for the rest of our lives. The eyes of the most wise and just man of our times closed on the recollection of that hour, and his mind on the study of these truths, heard from the lips of a child who was revealing himself to men, particularly if just. My eyes have continued to watch, and my mind to think, coordinating events and things. I have had the privilege of hearing the Most High speak through the mouth of a child, who later was a man just, wise, mighty, holy, and who was put to death just because of these qualities of his. His words of that time have afterwards been confirmed by events that happened many years later, at the time mentioned by Daniel. Poor me, as I did not understand sooner, as I awaited the last terrible sign to believe, to understand. Poor people of Israel, who did not understand then and does not understand even now. The prophecy of Daniel and those of other prophets and of the word of God continue and will be fulfilled for Israel, stubborn, blind, deaf, unjust, as it continues to persecute the Messiah in his servants. Just pause there for another moment. We have this reference to a child in the temple that Gamaliel recalled seeing and hearing. And we also have a reference to the wisest rabbi of our days. That rabbi will be Hillel, and the child in the temple was Jesus. And the episode we're all familiar with who've read Luke's Gospel. It's when Jesus is in the temple speaking to the doctors of the law, and which is the fifth joyful mystery of the Rosary. And so we know then that Rabbi Hillel, the great Rabbi Hillel's eyes closed contemplating that event, that Hillel throughout the rest of his life was thinking about this strange boy who appeared and then disappeared, because as we know, Mary took him back to Nazareth with Joseph, and Jesus then led a normal life to all outward appearances until his public ministry began approximately 20 years later. And we have Gamaliel also referring to the prophecy of Daniel particularly. That prophecy is in chapter 9 of the book of Daniel, and it refers to 490 years, 70 weeks of years. 490 years which will pass from the order of the pagan king to rebuild Jerusalem to the coming of the Messiah, when he will be cut off. And following on from that will be the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem itself. And if we count 69 of those 70 weeks of years, from the time of the decree to rebuild Jerusalem, we get to the time of Jesus. And as we know, Jesus is killed on the cross. And what Gamaliel doesn't know there, but no doubt fully expects, is that Jerusalem is eventually destroyed by a prince who is to come, as it says in chapter 9 of Daniel. And that prince who is to come comes from Italy, Titus, the son of Vespasian, who then surrounds Jerusalem and destroys it. Continuing Saul's response now. Damn, you are blaspheming. There will really be no salvation for the people of God if the rabbis of Israel blaspheme and deny Jehovah, the true God, to exalt and believe in a false Messiah. Gamaliel replies, I am not blaspheming, but all those are who insulted the Nazarene and continue to despise him by scorning his followers. You, yes, you are blaspheming because you hate him in himself and in his followers. But you were right when you said that there is no more salvation for Israel, not because there are Israelites who have passed into his flock, but because Israel has struck him to death. Saul replies, you fill me with horror. You are betraying the law, the temple. Denounce me then to the Sanhedrin, that I may share the lot of him who is about to be stoned. It will be the beginning and the happy conclusion of your mission, and I shall be forgiven through this sacrifice of mine for not having recognized and understood the God who was passing as Saviour and Master among us, his children and his people. Saul, with an angry gesture, goes away rudely to the court facing the hall of the Sanhedrin, the court in which the crowd is still shouting in exasperation against Stephen. In this court, Saul joins the torturers who were waiting for him, and with the others he comes out of the temple and then out of the town walls. Abuse, jeers continue to be shouted at and blows to be dealt to the deacon, who, already tired out and wounded, proceeds staggering towards the place of the execution. Just pause there for a moment. You've heard Gamaliel refer twice, I think, to Saul persecuting Jesus, not only in himself, but also in his followers. And that is reminiscent of what Jesus says to Saul on the road to Damascus. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And Saul says he's not persecuting him. But Jesus makes it clear to Saul that by persecuting the Christians, he is persecuting Jesus. And it's quite possible that Jesus chose those words to cause Saul to remember what Gamaliel, his master, had said to him. Or it's simply the case that the Holy Spirit put on the lips of Gamaliel those very words to ensure that Saul would have a recollection when he fell off his horse and became blind of the warning he'd been given by Gamaliel before Stephen was stoned to death. Continuing the narrative. Outside the walls there is a stretch of wasteland covered with stones, completely desert. When the executioners arrive there, they spread out, forming a circle, leaving the condemned man all alone in the centre, with his torn garments and his body bleeding in many parts, as a result of the wounds already inflicted on it. They tear his garments off him before moving away from him. Stephen is left with a very short tunic. They all take their long garments off and remain with their tunics only, as short as the one worn by Saul, to whom they entrust their garments, as he does not take part in the lapidation, either because he's been upset by Gamaliel's words, or because he knows that he's not good at hitting the mark. The executioners pick up some large pebbles and some sharp stones in which the place abounds, and they begin the lapidation. Stephen receives the first blow standing, and with a smile of forgiveness on his wounded lips, which a moment before the beginning of the lapidation have shouted to Saul, intent on gathering the clothes of the lapidators, "My friend, I will wait for you on the way of the Christ." To which Saul replied, "Pig, possessed," adding to the insult a mighty kick on the shin bone of the deacon, who almost falls because of the blow and of the pain. After some blows with stones that strike him from all directions, Stephen falls on his knees, supporting himself with his wounded hands, and certainly recollecting a remote episode, he whispers, touching his temple and his wounded forehead, "As he foretold me, the crown, the rubies, O my Lord, Master, Jesus, receive my spirit." Another hail of blows on his already wounded head makes him collapse on the ground that becomes impregnated with his blood. While he lies on the stones, always under hails of more of them, on the point of breathing his last, he whispers, "Lord, Father, forgive them. Bear them no grudge for this sin of theirs. They do not know what." Death breaks the sentence on his lips. A last start makes him curl himself up, and he remains so, dead. The executioners approach him. They throw another volley of stones on him and almost bury him under them. They then put their clothes on, and they go away back to the temple, intoxicated with satanic zeal, to report what they have done. While they are speaking to the high priest and other mighty people, Saul goes in search of Gamaliel. He does not find him at once. Inflamed with hatred against the Christians, he goes back to the priests. He speaks to them. He convinces them to give him a parchment with the seal of the temple, authorizing him to persecute the Christians. The blood of Stephen must have made him as furious as a bull that sees red, or a generous wine given to an alcoholic. He is about to come out of the temple when he sees Gamaliel under the porch of the Gentiles. He goes to him. Perhaps he wants to begin a dispute or a justification. But Gamaliel goes across the court. He enters a hall and closes the door in the face of Saul, who, offended and furious, runs out of the temple to persecute the Christians.